Well, we're still missing a panelist, but Heather Grubby is probably
She's around.
appearing shortly. So while we're waiting, let me introduce this panel. There's Heather. Hello. So we had a great introduction, but a little bit, pretty gloomy introduction to the day. We will attempt to brighten this up. It will be difficult, but we will try. We will look at what the EU is possibly doing as a guardian, should be doing, and can actually be doing as a guardian of democracy in Europe. We have a great panel. I don't want to introduce everyone separately because you have it in the booklet, and it probably takes up too much time, and then we're halfway through, and that's probably more positive than the last panel already introducing the panelists. But we will move right to the issue. But we have a panel from people from Hungary, from Germany, from the UK. We have academics, civil society activists, politicians. We have a political background, we have an institutional, we have a legal background. So everyone is here. Also, sort of nearly, if you take me out, because I'm only the moderator, we have a great gender balance. So everything is here. Yeah, I'm neutral. But also we will experiment with technology. I think it's done here at the CEU all the time, but obviously I haven't done it very much. We will experiment with analog technology, so nothing is in the cloud. It all stays here in this bunker, and we all have these little devices, and then you can press, and then we get the answer straight behind us. So you see that thing. And let's start before we start discussing. Let's start with two issues, two questions, and test out this technology. First question is coming up. Will you be participating in the upcoming EP parliamentary elections?
I don't want to see any no's.
Yes, no, maybe. Or no, don't know. So you press. Vote now. And there's a question coming up shortly afterwards. Complicated. Oh. No. Okay. 15% no.
It's raised back immediately.
17%. Here's a former member of the European Parliament, so you have to talk to her. The 15%. We set up a table outside afterwards. And then the next question. Do you currently consider the European Union a guardian of democracy in Europe? That will be interesting. Oh, rather no. 33, don't know, 10. So that's 43, so it's quite close. But still, we are more on the positive side. With this, I would turn to Franziska. Franziska was until recently a member of the European Parliament, sitting in Brussels, now a member of the German Bundestag, sitting in Berlin. What would you say? Is the EU a guardian, or if it's not, when did the EU lose it, or was it never a guardian?
Yeah, difficult. I think in general, of course, in a way, it's a guardian for democracy, because you have to be a democracy in becoming a member of the European Union, and the EU has worked out this quite precisely in its chapters and in the Copenhagen criteria and the entire process that you have to go through. And you have the treaty with our fundamental values, and then you have the Charter for Fundamental Rights, which has some very fundamental human rights and democratic principles in there. You have an agency sitting in Vienna with the task of monitoring the human rights, fundamental values across Europe. We have some mechanisms to punish those member states that really go off the track of democracy. But on the other side, I believe that we have still much more precise mechanisms and sanction mechanisms to check budget discipline in member states than to check democracy. So in that sense, I think de facto, in an everyday life, it's not so much a guardian, even though in theory and certainly in general, when you know, for membership, it is an important criteria. But when I, as a member of the European Parliament, I was always amazed by the degree of detail how we check on budgets, and the degree of non-preciseness on democracy and human rights.
So you would say, what I would say when I started to learn Russian, there was a great term, в принципе. So in principle, the EU is a guardian, or maybe as Oasis would say, definitely maybe.
Radically unprecise, yeah.
So now we turn to a lawyer, and then of course the answer will be much more precise. So Andras, how would you explain the EU as a guardian, if at all a guardian in theory, but maybe also in practice? And maybe that's how a lawyer can explain it. In theory, yes. In practice, no. And
I mean, directly, the EU is not a guardian of member state democracies. In theory, we have a possibility, Article 7 in the EU Treaty, but everybody knows it's not operative in practice. So there is a theoretical possibility, but in practice, it cannot be used. And there are proposals what should be changed, like suspension of financial supports by the European Union, but you would actually need to change primary law, and definitely secondary legislation, but probably also primary law in order to achieve that, and it's very unlikely that it would happen. So I would say, those are not, in theory you have a guardianship on the side of the EU. In practice, it's not operative. I think there are ways how to achieve that, practical ways. And I think those practical ways are not, or they should not be concentrated on the role of the Commission or on the role of the European Parliament, because these bodies consist of politicians. And when you have a debate about, a concept and you want to attach legal consequence to it, then you need proper legal doctrine in order to apply it, and you do not have that type of measurable proper legal doctrine for democracy. It just does not exist. What does exist is proper legal doctrine for the protection of fundamental rights, and that's why I think that the best possibility for protecting democracy within the EU, within the member states, is actually an indirect way. It's strengthening the protection of fundamental rights through the European Court of Justice.
Mm-hmm. Okay, we come to the specifics later on, but I want to sort of finish the panel on the guardianship. Heather, you are the Open Society advocate in Brussels. Do you consider the EU a guardian still, or has it ever been or not?
It has never been, and it never will be, because the member states don't want it to be. The Commission has the specific role of being the guardian of the treaties of the EU, and of course the treaties contain an important provision. I can read you Article 2, which is the EU's values that were set out. The Union is founded on the values of respect for human dignity, freedom, democracy, equality, the rule of law, and respect for human rights, including the rights of persons belonging to minorities, motherhood, and apple pie. Okay, so I invented the last two. But it's very general, and it's not defined. And so I think the big issue about democracy in the Union is the old Polish saying, if I might quote a bit of Polish here, which is, the question of Poland. Polska tak, ale jakie? So, yes, of course, Poland, but which one? And it's the same question. Yeah, of course we all believe in democracy, but which democracy do we believe in? And the treaties do not spell that out. The institutions don't spell that out. The EU has never had a democracy acquis for the very good reason that there is a huge variety of democratic cultures, political cultures, practices of democracy, institutions across the Union. I think the issue is not about democracy. The EU cannot play a role in democracy in the member states because these are matters that the individual countries have to decide for themselves. Where it can play a very fundamental role is in two further goals which democracy is supposed to lead to. Democracy is not an end in itself, after all. Democracy is supposed to deliver benefits. It's a system that delivers benefits. One of those benefits where the EU can help is good governance, and the other one is fundamental rights, respect for and protection of fundamental rights. And there the EU can play a role. Democracy also delivers plenty of other benefits that we can debate, but I think the EU can help on those two things. Now, governance is about the formal and informal institutions that determine who gets what in a given country. In Hungary, it's pretty clear who's in charge of governance. Now, what the EU can do is to say whether that system is fair and whether the institutions are adequate, because they also relate to the way in which the country's governance affects how it observes EU law and how it runs things like its observance of the single market. And the second thing is the fundamental rights side, where it's not very strong. This is a fairly weak area of EU law. I mean, it's still quite soft law. But the EU is an important reference point because the Charter of Fundamental Rights brings together many of the international human rights standards and also the practices within the member states. And most importantly of all, the EU has a system of law, a community of law, including a court, which can adjudicate on those rights. And of course, we all know that there is the European Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg, a separate institution, part of the Council of Europe. But the EU's own court, the Court of Justice of the European Union in Luxembourg, is now making a lot more reference to fundamental rights. It's becoming a much more activist court. And it can, of course, issue sanctions. It can issue fines on member states, which the Strasbourg court cannot. So if the EU can get more involved in the fundamental rights field, that would be a good thing. The question is whether the member states actually will try to prevent that from happening. And I'd be happy to discuss that in a bit more detail later on.
Okay, great. So, Jan Werner, how do you see it? Professor from Princeton, looking at Europe from the outside, because of course being a European. So, as an academic, is the EU a guardian, or do you? So far, we had more of a no, maybe. Maybe you are the one from the 57%.
Let me make 2 points, one of which will come down to radically disagreeing with Heather about what she just said. This conference features the word strategy very prominently in various places. I think to have a strategy, you need to understand what the challenge or the problem is you're dealing with, and you need to know where you eventually want to end up. What does it mean to, in a sense, successfully carry through a strategy? Maybe we can talk about the second issue later on. But first of all, I think it's very important to diagnose the challenge correctly. Personally, I think we go off on a wrong track if we assume that the challenges we're dealing with today in Europe all come down to fundamental rights violations. It's a very important issue, but I think in courts as they exist can deal with these rights violations. I think we're also going off on a wrong track if we assume that it's all about corruption. Very important problem too. But let's not throw everything together. What we're really dealing with as a challenge today in Europe is what you might call constitutional capture. And this can be a formal process, as happened in this country, or it can be a more informal attempt, probably best example, Romania in the summer of 2012. I think we are dealing with people trying to create, capture a whole political system in a deeply partisan fashion. And that will not obviously always immediately translate into fundamental rights violations. Yes, it can. The right to vote can be violated in certain ways, for instance. But we need to be clear about the problem we're dealing with. So, that brings us to the second point. Is Europe ever in a position to judge whether a country is a democracy or not? What we hear a lot from people is that, oh no, Europe is so diverse, we all have different ideas about what democracy really is. How can you compare the UK, which doesn't even have a constitutional court, to Bulgaria? Everything's different. Plus, we love diversity in Europe. It's a value in itself, etc., etc. Okay. Every single time we allow a country to join the European Union, somebody somewhere makes a call as to whether this country is now a liberal democracy or not. You can say, and I would say, that these processes as they exist, Copenhagen criteria and so on, are deeply flawed. The checklist, approach that says, do all the courtrooms have computers? Check. Do all the lawyers have, 3 years of training? Check. And then in the end, there's a huge box that says rule of law, and then you say check as well. Deeply flawed, granted. But it's not true that we don't make a call about a political system as a whole. We do. Yeah. And we do it every single time that a country joins the EU. So I think these should be our starting points. A, the problem is constitutional capture. B, of course the EU is in a position to judge whether a country is a democracy or not. The challenge is to formalize this process, to improve this process, to, if I may add one more word, to empower a particular agency that can make these calls in a more systematic, predictable, and accountable way. So that would be my starting point for this discussion.
Okay, we come back to the agency and who can do that. But I'm glad you came in because otherwise these 57% would have looked a bit strange. But you wanted to come in?
Yeah, just very briefly, because I agree with what Jan Werner Müller just said, because I think there is a difference between systematic abuse and individual, rights that are abused. And in many of the countries we see, until you get individual rights abused, you have a long time to go. And until this case could ever go up to the European Court of Justice, if so possible, we would be already quite far away from where we should be. And everybody, it's always the question, if you ask somebody, if you see it, it's an abuse. If you have to describe, it's more difficult, but everybody sort of agrees, and when you see it in reality, then you agree, yes, that's sort of not democratic, or that, it's more easy than some pretend to define it. And I believe that it's not just an Eastern European question. We were saying that there was also systematic abuse, for example, of the freedom of media in Italy, just because of the monopolization of, in a few hands of very few rich people, and that de facto you almost had no more independent media. So for that was for us also a systematic abuse, even though there was no real individual right that, somebody could have gone to court and said, I can't open my mouth, I can't speak. It was, complete freedom. But of course, you had Berlusconi media checking everything. So it's not just an Eastern European, but it's systematic, you have a problem there. And that's where I think the EU really has to play a bigger role.
Okay, let me pick you up on the question of making a call. Before you can make a call, there must be some way of monitoring, of deciding who is where. And that's exactly the second question, which we have already anticipated, or the third question on the monitoring side. So who should monitor the state of democracy in the EU? Four options. And it's member states. Yeah? So Helmut, we have civil society in. Are you voting?
No, I am.
Oh. Interesting. Well.
Somebody says other, who's other?
So it's it's nearly sort of equal. We have 4 people on the panel, so maybe each of us can take up one. I would start with Heather, because I know from your work with the Open Society Institute, but also before working for the European Commission, Enlargement Commissioner, you've been on both sides of the monitoring side. So what would you take out of this? Who should monitor?
Well, I was working with the somebodies somewhere who made some of these calls. And the way it happens is quite interesting, because during the accession process, maybe I'll get up and be a bit interactive with this poll. During the accession process, this is the one that makes the recommendation with a lot of input from this, and especially this. I think during the accession process, civil society is actually very powerful because it's the main reference point that the Commission draws on the state of democracy in its annual progress reports. But the other is ultimately the one that decides. Okay, so recommendation, and then this one makes the big recommendation to this, which is the member states. It's the European Council, it's the peers of the country who decide. So it's the other prime ministers and presidents who decide whether or not they think they can live with the guy who's standing in front of them saying, let me be a member of the club too. But I think the problem is that the other can also include quite a lot of other things. For example, the press often decides on these matters too. So it depends whether there have been press reports about problems with democracy. But I think Jan Werner has very rightly pointed out the fundamental problem in the whole question of the EU's role in democracy, which is the lack of an acquis, the lack of a legal framework, the lack of detailed provisions or even a detailed definition beyond what I just read out in terms of Article 2 or the Copenhagen criteria, which are very similar. It's the stability of institutions, guaranteeing democracy, rule of law, respect for and protection of minority rights and human rights. That's basically it. It's very short. And it hasn't, I agree very much that what the EU needs to do is to develop a much more reliable, accountable, systemic framework to do this. And I've argued this in writing a number of times over the past 15 years, that the EU needs an acquis démocratique. The problem is that there's no political appetite to create one. And so as a result, the EU is in this strange limbo position between the nuclear option and not even rubber bullets, the kind of pop guns that children use. It's got material sanctions which are really very low level, or it has the nuclear option, and it doesn't really have anything in between when there are problems. So it has a problem with definition of what is democracy that allows governments to claim, well, this isn't really such a big problem after all, and this is something that Hungary's got away with many times with constitutional provisions. And then even when there is an agreement that something is unacceptable, it doesn't have enough of a range of options about what to do about it. Now, I want to just tell you briefly about two of those options and why I think they could be changed. One is on the material sanctions. The material sanctions are based on an extremely narrow legal basis. It's basically about the single market and non-discrimination. So, for example, when Hungary's constitutional amendments were criticised by the EU, who were the three commissioners who were actually able to criticise them and threaten to take Hungary to court? Okay, it was not about the impact of those provisions on democracy in Hungary, not at all. It was Olli Rehn who said, well, you can't compromise the independence of the central bank because that's going to be damaging for adoption of the euro. Okay, so there's a completely different, small, narrow legal basis somewhere else, not really to do with democracy. And it was Neelie Kroes, the Digital Agenda Commissioner, who said, you can't do this because what you're doing on the media, because you're discriminating between foreign media providers and domestic media providers. So it's a competition issue. Again, narrow, tiny legal issue, far away. There aren't sanctions on the democracy side that the EU can use. So that's a problem. But then if you want to escalate up to the nuclear option, which is Article 7, which is to threaten to sanctions the suspension of certain rights of a member state, including voting rights, you need to meet a very, very high threshold. First of all, as Francisco was pointing out, it needs to be serious and persistent violation of the principles of the Union, which is a really high thing to reach, and it doesn't address systemic failings at a lower level that then lead you to that, so you don't have an interim provision. And also, you have to get that agreed unanimously by the other member states, who are all sitting in their chairs thinking, well, if they're going after him today, maybe they'll go after me next week. I don't think I really like this. So they're very, very reluctant to use it. It requires a very high threshold in the parliament where the party grouping that the country in question might belong to really doesn't like one of their members being criticised and can very effectively use lobbying. Again, we've seen this again in the case of Hungary. Very effective it was too. And it requires a commission report, and the commissioners too can be very reluctant to move into an area where they don't really have a legal basis. So it's just too high a threshold really to use it. Now, Viviane Reding, the Justice Commissioner, has just proposed last month, a new provision which is supposed to be an interim step of exactly the kind that several of us have been arguing for. But the problem is it's still too high a threshold. It's still not adequate. I think you probably don't want to go into all the details of this, but again, there's a fundamental problem that member states are worried about democracy among some of their members, but they're not worried enough to do anything that might rebound on them as well.
we're still on the question of monitoring because we want to come to what the EU could actually do before we move to all of you to help us work something out of this panel so that we can all go back and not say we have the answer. But coming back to you, what you said about initially about the Copenhagen criteria. It's true we don't have a acquis démocratique, but what we have is we have the Copenhagen criteria only for accession, but is there more in it? I mean, can the Copenhagen criteria be used not only when you enter, but afterwards? That may, because you brought it up, maybe you can say something about it.
Allow me to perhaps say two things. One is that it's true that it would probably be disastrous if we had a repetition of the experience leading up to the ill-fated constitutional treaty, when Europeans are forced to get together and really examine whether when they say Rechtsstaat, État de droit, etc., whether they really mean the same thing. They probably don't. And so we probably would be opening a Pandora's box if we had an idea that, oh, first we have to have a nice academic exercise of agreeing on all these definitions. Very unlikely to happen. At the same time, that doesn't mean that we cannot agree on certain parameters. If you look, let's say, at the opinions of the Venice Commission, it's not all over the place. It's not arbitrary. People do agree on certain core understandings. So when the Venice Commission, for instance, criticized certain aspects of the recent Hungarian constitution-making process, I think you could, in a sense, distill some criteria from that that wouldn't force you to say, oh, but first we have to really, define everything and be exactly on the same page. Second remark, very briefly, about this. Well, it's disappeared now, but I think maybe it's important to say that these are not mutually exclusive options. And in particular, I think it's worth saying that some critics occasionally now say, well, so if the EU becomes the guardian of democracy, it's essentially more constitutional paternalism, the kind of thing that Renata was criticizing this morning, that, we impose essentially various forms of the acquis and of standards and norms, and they're never really debated, they're never truly appropriated by civil society. All this is true. But in a sense, having more guardianship, if you like, doesn't exclude the possibility of more civil society involvement. It gives it a certain backup. Nothing prevents all of us here from walking outside that door and starting whatever, European Citizens Initiative. Go out, collect 1 million signatures. You can do this anytime. Having the Commission or the Parliament or a Copenhagen Commission also be involved in this process doesn't foreclose these options. So I think we shouldn't have this fake debate that it's either popular constitutionalism or it's constitutionalism by more established institutions. It can be both, and there's no dilemma here in that sense.
Okay, so I would be very happy if we walk out of this door and create something. But maybe Franziska, I know that you've been thinking a lot about the Copenhagen criteria in your time, but also now in Brussels. What's your take?
Yeah, I agree. Also wanted to mention the Venice Commission. I'm not sure if everybody of you is familiar with it. It's a body, Venice as the name, of highly distinguished scholars who we often send actually abroad to export democratic principles. And the EU is financing it, and then we always know what we mean when we talk about democratic principles. So sometimes, we don't know it internally. We export it all the time. When we are in the accession process, we always know it. And once we are inside, nobody knows again what the democratic principles are. So in that sense, I would agree with you that we don't necessarily need a sort of a constitutional process defining them, but sort of adopting what we already do anyways. Then on the role, I just wanted to say, of civil society and European Parliament, I think the European Parliament is a good place to air concerns, but de facto not to do a real monitoring, because it's always blocked by one or the other political family. And that's, I've seen it so many times. Everybody in private could agree with you that yes, we have problems in Romania, Bulgaria, or Hungary or Italy or France, but then the party politics go beyond it, and you just vote with your party and your party family. In that sense, I would be less sure that the European Parliament can be the final monitor, but it can play in airing concerns and having a debate on questions like media freedom, etc. And for us, of course, it was always very important to get information from civil society actors. Like that is certainly key for getting information, for making a point, is to get the information from the ground from actors. So I would see there certainly no either or, but a close cooperation. But would still warn against making the European Parliament the final arbiter, because I don't think it was sad to see. Also on Berlusconi, that was such a sad vote. I'm like, really, everybody could agree on the danger of media freedom in Italy, but just didn't get it through.
But at least we see that there's an end to it. But Andras, you brought the idea of the courts, the legal approach in it, but there must be still some way of monitoring. How would you see it?
I mean, first of all, just a remark on Jan Werder Müller's contribution. I entirely agree with him that the problem is not just about corruption, and the problem is not just about the protection of fundamental rights. But I disagree with him on the point whether it is possible to build up a new institution like he is proposing it. Probably many of those present in the room know about his proposal on the Copenhagen Commission. I have doubts whether it's possible, because basically for such an institution you would need the agreement of all the member states, and I just cannot see this happen. So it's not realistic, I think, the introduction of this institution. Actually, if you want, as you also mentioned, if you want to have a body which monitors, the quality of democracy in general in EU member states, then you already have the Venice Commission, which is not just about EU member states. So you do actually have a body which is doing it, but it's quite a different thing to give recommendations, and it's quite a different thing to build up an institutions and to have legal consequences attached to it. If you want to have such a procedure, at the end of the day, it has to end up at a court. This decision has to be able to be reviewed by a court, and it has to be the European Court of Justice. And I think the question is not going to the right direction. I mean, in Bavaria you don't have democracy because in Berlin there is a body of the German federal government which monitors the quality of democracy in Bavaria, or in other federal countries. Basically, what you need is an institutional framework. You cannot just implement democracy on the spot. You need an institutional framework, and for that institutional framework, that's really just a framework. You cannot make actual democracy on the spot. The institutional framework, that would be the protection of fundamental rights, and probably also a more efficient fight against corruption. Who knows what's going to happen? I think that's actually much more important than having a new body, which is, as I said, unlikely to be able to be set up. Having a new body which monitors democracy on the spot.
Okay, now we are coming to the key point. This was all sort of foreplay. Now we're coming to the point. How can the EU actually uphold democracy? What are the instruments? We talked about courts, we talked about other things. So we have another question for you. So it's a bit more complicated, so you get another few seconds. Good. Interesting. Both at least is better than none. Okay, with this, that's the key session, and then I would like to involve you in it, because maybe we have 4 great ideas, but maybe there are others out there. Jan Werner, you wrote a very interesting blog post on Verfassungsblog. I mean, I'm not a regular reader, but I liked it very much, where you made the point that in theory there's a lot there, but in practice it's not used. So maybe you can say how the EU can uphold.
Just very briefly to Andras, if turnover of power is a criterion, I'm not sure we have democracy in Bavaria. And that's actually not a joke, because at some point...
That's what I wanted to say.
Yeah, but it's in a sense, it's a serious point, because you could imagine whole European countries at some point saying, look, it's true, we never have a turnover of power, but you have then examples within what everybody considers to be certainly consolidated democracy. So, again, it's a real challenge to say where the problem is. Anyway, just an aside. So, what's an effective mechanism? Maybe just a word on Article 7, which has already come up. So yes, there are concerns here about it being the nuclear option, the thresholds are very high. I agree with all of that. But maybe it's also worth putting on the table a thought about what it actually is in its essence and what it does. Because people think of Article 7 as a sanction. Yes, in certain ways it is. But it's actually not really a form of intervention in the country itself. It's a kind of, if you like, normative quarantine. It basically isolates a country. It says, we have such doubts about your democratic processes that we, the rest of us Europeans, don't want to be subject to rules and regulations that your government has had a hand in. That's very different from saying we want to do something directly in the country or against a particular government. It basically says we don't want to play with you anymore. And as we know from, kids and sandboxes and so on, that can be very effective in certain ways. But it's really just a kind of let's leave you alone. And in theory, it can go on forever. There's nothing in it, in the mechanism itself, that forces that particular country to change anything, do anything, and so on. So I think that has led some of us, quite apart from concerns about the high thresholds, to think that maybe one needs actual intervention along the lines of, let's say, financial penalties. Clearly, there's also a discussion to be had here about who's going to be hit by these penalties. It's usually not, those in government. It's not the oligarchs who are hit by them. We can talk about all that. But it seems these are the sort of at least second best solutions one could think of when one has realized that Article 7 itself, even if it were possible, doesn't really force a country to engage in any sort of immediate change. So hence the proposal is to kind of try to do more on this front. It probably requires treaty change. As you all know, all of us are being held hostage by the UK at the moment as far as the question of treaty change is concerned. But if ever a moment comes where anything is possible at all, then I think one could move towards a new institution in terms of monitoring, but also one that, in a sense, could pull the trigger of sanctions, hopefully highly targeted, smart sanctions, as the cliche goes, and take it from there. And then just hope that will bring about change by a particular government.
Thank you. Heather, you mentioned a few times the nuclear threat of this. And I just wonder, when I hear this, whether that is in a way similar to the nuclear threat in the Cold War, something which was there, but no one then used it, because and that's similar to Draghi. We will do whatever it takes, and then you don't have to actually do it. Is that the function of Article 7?
Well, the thing is, Draghi had the weapon of a wall of money, whereas the EU, there isn't really a weapon. Sanctions don't work in a club. The EU is ultimately a club. And when every country has a seat at the table, it's very difficult to make sanctions work. That's why, for example, the CVM, the Cooperation and Verification Mechanism that was put in place to make sure that Romania and Bulgaria didn't backslide on their commitments, it never worked, because once they were at the table, they could always plead their case. So you have to think about it much more. Let's look at sociology. We have some very distinguished sociologists in the room. Think about the sociology of these groups, of these kinds of clubs, and how they really function. You're never going to have a sanction of an independent body which can come down hard and really hurt a country, because nobody in the club's going to vote for that kind of sanction. It's just not going to happen. But what you can have are social pressures, and they can be quite severe. Of course, it's also useful to have appeal to the law and to courts and so on. But the social pressure can be quite powerful, and there's some very interesting recent academic work on how social pressure works in the EU from the kind of constructivist strain. I can see a whole CEU research project starting up here. And I would suggest three forms of social pressure that could be more effective, because as Jan Wenner was rightly pointing out, isolation doesn't work because you have no exit strategy. That's another problem with Article 7. If you don't know what your exit strategy is, you're very unlikely to start going down that road. That's why it was never used on Austria in 1999 when the Freiheitliche Österreichs was invited to join the government. So no exit strategy, but also isolation, it doesn't cause change, it doesn't do it. So instead of isolating a country, you need to do what the EU normally does with problems. You hug it tight. You draw it into a dialogue, into an engagement that makes it very difficult for that government just to go off and do its own sweet thing. And of course, you can make that quite a public engagement, which then empowers local civil society to play a much bigger role by having, for example, transparent proceedings. I think one of the problems with Reading's latest proposal is that the dialogue between the Commission and the country concerned would happen behind closed doors. It would be all kept secret. No, go and have a public hearing. Mr. Orban, says Viviana. No, Victor, my friend, can you please just explain to me exactly how the media is going to be regulated in this country? And then his public answer is there on public record. You need something public like that, because that is what really empowers civil society and the local press. You also need, I think, in order to do that, much more careful monitoring. That's another part of hug tight. And here I would give a mandate to the Fundamental Rights Agency, a very, very good body set up in Vienna with an extremely limited mandate, because again, the member states don't want to be monitored. So they can't do country monitoring. They can only do monitoring on issues. Now, they've done some very good monitoring, but they need to be given a mandate for some kind of country monitoring where they can actually issue independent reports on what's going on with enough detail, enough detail to allow a broader public debate. I think a European public prosecutor, as Andras rightly pointed out, is also helpful in this respect, because again, you can have a formal public proceeding of some kind to talk about infringements. So it's not only the Commission in dialogue with the government in private. I think EPP idea needs a lot more discussion. It's kind of gone behind closed doors in Brussels. And finally, you can give life to the Charter of Fundamental Rights. Now, I take the point that it's not just all about rights. I mean, okay, I work for Open Society Foundations. I'm going to talk about rights, but the point is the Charter is actually much broader than classical human rights. The Charter covers all kinds of things that deal with different aspects of democracy, and the fact that it's soft law is exactly why its drafters managed to get away with piling in lots and lots of different issues, including quite a few that have to do with democracy. But it's not much discussed in the Union. It's not become public. I think the idea of a European Citizens Initiative on part of the Charter or on making the Charter real would be helpful. Again, to make people, and there I think there's a political goal, which is to make people see that a fight between the EU institutions and a government is not about Brussels versus we the people, which is how it's been portrayed in this country and in others, because that's a very easy thing to do. Brussels is coming to criticise us, whereas I know best what my country needs. Very, very easy line to peddle. But instead what you need is somebody to come along and say, to have a public debate within the country about the rights that the EU has given to people by virtue of the Charter and how they should exercise them, and whether the government is actually respecting those rights adequately. So here, the hugging tight is about having a much more detailed debate, because if it's just a political fight between Victor and his counterparts, it's never really going to go anywhere. Especially if it's not Victor versus Viviana. We know who's going to win that public relations battle. No, you need it to be a much more detailed discussion in public, involving civil society, involving the local press. That's the only mechanism that really sanctions a government.
Okay, and as a side note, I just would like to say the Bavarians probably would be very happy that they are discussed here at the European level and as a case study. So I just say this to the Bavarians. But coming to Andras, from what I understand, you say we just need a functioning constitutional court and everything would be okay. I mean, that seems to be a pretty straightforward, easy solution in a way. That's a very German solution, so, must work. So maybe you can explain to us why no one came to it before if it's so straightforward.
Yeah, basically the key is the European Charter on Fundamental Rights. There is a key provision, a full library of literature, and that's Article 51 of the Charter. This is about the applicability of EU fundamental rights. And there are different interpretations in the literature, and that's the key issue to understand the problem here. And I disagree with Heather. The Charter is not soft law. It is actually like real law. And the question is in which scope it can be applied. And there are basically 4 opinions. There is a traditional, and in Germany actually, widely held opinion, that it can only be applied in extreme cases of breach. Then there is a second opinion also held by the European Court of Justice, that it can always be applied when you apply EU law or when you apply EU law which was implemented. And then it has been widened step by step. There was a very famous, very important decision 1 year ago, it was the Okerberg-Franson decision, which said that also if it's just a collateral application, you have to apply the Charter. That broadened very much the application of the Charter. There's a third opinion promoted by Armin von Bogdandy, the director of the Heidelberg. Yeah.
My hometown.
Yeah, and my boss in Heidelberg. I also work in Heidelberg. Anyway, he promotes the idea of the so-called reverse Zoolanger approach. He said that basically the Charter should be applied also, in cases in domestic cases, if you have a systematic violation of fundamental rights. If the fundamental rights protection system fails, then you just grab the Charter. So in these extreme cases, there's a 4 proposal which says that you should basically apply the Charter in any purely domestic case too, and that would be actually my proposal. This would broaden very much the scope of the Charter, and this is important because the Charter is not just applicable by a constitutional court. The Charter is applicable by any court, and EU law has primacy over national law. So it means that even if you have 2/3 majority, if you have constitutional amending majority, even if you packed the constitutional court, ordinary courts will have the possibility, or should have the possibility, it's an open debate, should have the possibility to rely on the Charter in order to disapply national laws. I think that would be the key, and obviously it does not solve all the problems. But I think this is the key issue, and this is probably the most important, which would give the framework in order to have the possibility to build up democracy or strengthen it.
I would just ask you again, just to imagine Hungary would be taken to court. We have heard in the panel before there is already a big anti-European sentiment in Hungary, kind of, we against all of them and so on. And if then the European Court would take Hungary to court, what would actually happen in real term? And I just want to, as a thought experiment.
What you're talking about is a sanction mechanism. In general, I have doubts about big formalized sanction mechanism. I mean, have a look how efficient are UN sanction mechanisms in order to build up democracy in countries. I wouldn't name any of them, but it's not really the way forward. And the trick of this proposal is that here the conflict would not be between the EU and the member state. The conflict would be here between a local court in a country, in Hungary, for example, and the government, because that local court can say, I just don't apply your law because it contradicts to the Charter. And that court should have the backing of the European Court of Justice through preliminary ruling, but the actual conflict, the direct conflict, would be between a local court and the government, which means it's much more difficult to conceptualize it as as a siege, against the whole world.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay, so Franziska, now it's time for your plan.
Yeah, let me start by saying that unfortunately, sometimes the judiciary itself is the target of the capturing of the state. So then, what do you do? So I think the judiciary way is an important one, but certainly cannot be the only one. We have also seen the same, for example, in accession countries, Croatia, Serbia, etc., where the judiciary is, is a target. So there you need something else in addition. So, I don't want to dismiss that way, and I have to discuss it with Bogdani, who is in my hometown where I'm elected from. But I think it can't be all. On Article 7, I still think Article 7 is very important, maybe for another reason, not necessarily on getting, every country back on the democratic track. But I think we should be more open to use it, because as many more competences we give on a higher European level, the more I, as a citizen, want to trust the Council to take decisions. And the more I want to know that there are only democratic governments sitting there taking decisions over my life. And I think if this trust is undermined on a European level, if, Belgian, Polish citizen has the impression that at least, a third of the government's deciding over my life are actually not really democratic, the less I'm going to accept European decisions. And I think in that sense, we really have to strengthen, again, Article 7, because I think people are not willing to transpose more competences on a European level if they feel it's not in good hands, because they can't vote for them. It's like in a federal system. I, in Germany, can't vote for the Bavarian government, even though it's quite influential in Germany. And sometimes I also, I wonder. But still, I believe the elections going on in Bavaria are quite, democratic. But if I would doubt that part, I would, very vehemently oppose Mr. Seehofer influencing German politics, who's, the head there. So I think Article 7 has that importance, which is not necessarily inside every country, but on a European level, it's very important in order to keep trust in the decision-making process. On the question on, how could it work, I agree with Heather on giving the Fundamental Rights Agency in Vienna another mandate of country reporting. I think that could be easily done. You don't need any treaty change for that. You don't even need unanimity in the Council for that, which is the beauty of it. It's qualified majority voting on agencies. So the agency mandate you can easily change, or easily, but compared to treaty change or unanimity, it's rather easy. And you just would have to add country mandates. They have actually very qualified staff. I think the reports they do are good. And then, you would have to take those reports seriously and have a follow-up on them. And that could be by the Commission. It could be by civil society actors who take it up locally, who feed in, who take it up. So I think that would be sort of my quick step, easy to do. And then the Commission, with its formal procedures, I very much agree that naming and shaming is sort of the important one. It has to be public, and you have to be able to discuss it. And then one final note I wanted to make. What I agree on is that every citizen should have the feeling that it's his and her own right to have a democratic government, and that the EU is defending this individual right. And it's not the EU imposing it on any government or any state, but it's my right as a German to have a democratic government. It's your right as a Hungarian to have a democratic government. And this is what the EU is there to supposedly, at least, to help you to defend and not to impose. And I think in order to get there, we need a very different rhetoric out of Brussels and a very different discourse. And there the judiciary can help that strength, but it won't be the only one, I think, which will be sufficient, but it's the one where we can help and say it's your right, you can go to your local court, it's your right, and the EU helps you to defend it. So I think in that sense there the judiciary comes in for me, but it's not sufficient. And on a final note, allow me to say that since last week in the German Bundestag, we have minority rights again. It also took, the opposition, which is smaller than the minority rights foreseen in the laws. It took us half a year to get the minority rights. So I also sometimes felt that it's not so democratic. Because in the laws it says 25% of the members can, for example, call for a special inquiry committee, but the opposition so far is only 20%. So we could not ask for any special inquiry committee or nothing since last week. So it took us half a year to get those rights. And without the threat of the Constitutional Court, we wouldn't be there, I'm almost sure.
So Germany is democratic again. But I would like to come back to you talked about the Copenhagen Commission, and maybe you can explain a bit more what that could entail. We had a meeting last week on the elections in Turkey, and what it meant for EU accession process and stuff. And at the end, we came to an interesting conclusion, is that Turkey actually may have a chance to enter the European Union as long as the European Union continues to lower its standards. So actually, we might come to a point where the current state of democracy in Turkey is good enough to join the European Union, simply because the European Union has changed. But we want to finish on an optimistic note, so you will explain what the Copenhagen Commission could do.
I think we would never put up with losing our fundamental right to Twitter, so there's no way that this could ever happen around here. Let me just, if I may, also add a word to Franziska's resounding appeal. I think maybe it's important to also say that it's not just about, you as a German citizen have a right to democracy, you as a Hungarian citizen, and so on. Don't forget that we cannot, as European citizens in this room, say, oh, these are faraway countries about which we don't really know enough, and so, yeah, there might be some problems there, and so on. If you have a European passport, you are governed by Mr. Orban. Yeah. These guys make decisions about our lives, even if you don't live in Hungary, and that's the meaning of European integration. So we all have a stake in this. Anyway, as a side remark. Very briefly also, if I may, because this has now come up several times, on András's proposal, just two things. One is, if we're competing on what is more realistic, I fear that basically making the Charter applicable everywhere and de facto moving towards the EU as a federal state, I'm not sure how realistic that is. And on a more normative level, I think European countries have a legitimate interest in a certain kind of constitutional pluralism and in defending different understandings of certain principles, values, and even rights. That's why the treaties also contain a principle of respect for the national identities and constitutional identities of the member states. I think there are good reasons for wanting to defend that as well. And also on the thought experiment, because then sometimes people say, oh, if any of this were to happen, we're going to see a huge nationalist backlash. Some countries will move permanently into a kind of Eurosceptic position, and so on and so forth. I think it's worth saying that any government that engages in what I earlier on called constitutional capture knows that it is on a collision course with Brussels. They're going to stoke Euroscepticism, nationalism, etc. preemptively anyway. So it's not that, by doing nothing, the EU can so save itself from more nationalism and Euroscepticism. It's going to happen anyway. And I think we can all think of examples where that mechanism essentially was at work. Plus, if you remain neutral and don't do anything as the EU, you're going to disappoint all those citizens who thought, let's say in 2004, that you now locked yourself into a supranational institutional set of guarantees so that if things didn't go terribly well, somebody somewhere was going to help you in some way. So again, it's not neutral. You're going to disappoint these people. You're going to create a lot of cynicism about the EU, and I think that would haunt us at some point. Now, let me get to your question. Copenhagen Commission. It's fair enough to say that, look, this is a typical EU thing. When we can't really think of a real solution, we invent a new body, and we pay more bureaucrats, and so on and so forth. Fair enough. The only thing is that it's just not clear why something like the Council of Europe can have a Venice Commission, and the EU, despite the fact that it has much deeper integration, there's much deeper, if you like, normative interdependence, in a way I was just trying to illustrate, in terms of all of us having a stake in every single national government, why we couldn't have a similar body. If, and this came up as a proposal as well, if we were to stick with the Venice Commission, and we essentially contract out our deepest normative concerns to the Council of Europe, what do we end up doing? Well, we bring Azerbaijan into the discussion. Do we want that, really? Plus, do we, in a sense, want to disable ourselves in certain ways because we have certain rules, laws in the EU, let's say on data protection, that are much more precise than what you have in the Council of Europe. So why not, in a sense, have a commission of one's own, so to speak, rather than saying we have to go with an existing body? So if we were at all to go down this road, I think we should aim for a body of mostly but not exclusively legal experts. It could also be elder stateswomen and elder statesmen, in the way that, if you recall, there was the famous or maybe infamous group of people who ultimately judged whether Austria was okay or not. The wise man who in 2000 eventually sort of said, yeah, it's okay. And nobody sort of came back and said, oh no, that was illegitimate, who were these people, how could they have said this? No, it was generally accepted that when they pronounced a certain verdict, that was okay. So something similar, I think, could be set up, and it would be people who obviously would know a lot about law, but who wouldn't default into the checklist mode, but would basically also have a proven capacity for overall political judgment, and would have good arguments to say, our overall call in the situation is yes, still liberal democracy, or they might say the kinds of things that some of our colleagues on the panel this morning said. I mean, exactly at that level of, do you still have checks and balances or not? Would this be controversial? To be sure. Would these people easily sort of engage in a kind of constitutional micromanagement? No, because like constitutional courts, they would have every incentive to be very, very cautious. They wouldn't want to immediately start, to meddle, because they know that they have very thin legitimacy. Many people would come back with exactly the argument I mentioned earlier on, that you should respect the constitutional identities of the member states. You shouldn't start, intervening everywhere. So ideally, these people would speak very infrequently. But if they were to speak, everybody would say, oh, now it's time to pay attention. Now something very serious is happening.
Okay, so we have a number of proposals here. The Fundamental Rights Agency needs a new mandate, the Copenhagen Commission, the courts, the European Court. Now, I think we would turn to you for all your proposals. Oh! So we have to be short. We can't always put a question up. Maybe we start there. Maybe you?
Thank you. My name is Balázs Dénes and I'm with the Open Society Foundation. One short comment and one question. The comment is to Heather. It would be great to broaden the mandate of the FRA, but I'm afraid that you already gave an answer to that. We just can't expect member states that they will say, hey, this is what I want. But there is one thing which would be possible, and that is making it mandatory for the Commission and the Parliament to ask the opinion of the FRA when it's about issues of fundamental rights. At the moment, this is only a possibility, and this really questions the whole essence of the FRA. So that's the comment. The question is more Hungary related. There is one thing which you haven't touched that I think it's essential. Is wanting to expect the EU to be more strict on financial administration of member states. It's another thing, to monitor what's happening with rule of law. There is one thing which we felt really strongly in Hungary, and that is what can the EU do, and how can we empower the EU for the future to be more powerful when corruption goes above the usual EU type of corruption. I'm sorry if I sound cynical, in a member state. I'm afraid that what's happening at the moment is Hungary is much closer to the Eastern type of kleptocracy than the gentleman's agreements type of corruption at the EU. What is happening now? There is a company group which is very close to the government party, which gets about 1/3 of the public procurements, or maybe even more. Basically, the government party is using EU funds to incite against the EU, and I see big problems with it. I don't see EU institutions to empower to go after these stories, and to expect Hungarian law enforcement agencies to do this work is just hugely naive. It's not happening. So maybe you have an answer.
Okay, maybe we take 3 questions, and maybe you can stay a little bit shorter. Who was there?
My name is Bodo Balázs. I'm curious about how you think about the role of the market. European countries are competing on a number of things like foreign investment, tax, higher education, and a number of things. Why do you think that internal migration can force countries to adjust their democratic potential? Because if they see that too many people are leaving because they're not happy with their country's democratic potential, then they will lose in a competitive situation. Do you think that's a potential solution rather than a top-down regulatory approach?
Yeah. Okay.
Thank you. Claudio Correcciun, Bucharest. The systemic breaches of rule of law, I see it as effects, not causes. And we should look at the electoral, political, ideological causes for these breaches. That brings me to a kind of a missing link in our discussion, namely European party federations. From academic research and observations, we see that they're increasingly cohesive, they're increasingly important as European platforms, including for national parties. And in the two crises you were mentioning, Romanian and Hungarian, it was exactly that thing that made the difference. In one case, there was a support from the party family, Hungary, and in the other case, Romania, there was no support from the European party family, the socialists, and that mattered. So I was wondering if we can explore the role of the European party federations as agents for democratic change, in the sense that, one, they're present in the treaties, they have a responsibility, they get funding from all of us. That's another reason. And secondly, I think they can, as they become more powerful and more responsible, they can put some pressure on the national parties, a pressure that is not at the institutional level, but it's a very pure political level. Thank you.
Okay, so maybe we move from Heather, starting with a question about the Fundamental Rights Agency, down towards here, and answer all the questions.
Actually, I'd like to come back on that last question, which I think is key. I mean, I think I just agree with Balázs, as on many things. And so let's keep exploring it. Let's come up with a proposal. I think that's a very interesting idea. But no, I think also the point you made about the EU does have a very clear mandate to go over abuse of public funds, abuse of EU money. There it has sanctions, it has political credibility, it has expertise. There are things it can do. It's not perfect, but that's a system that could use. And Alina Mungiapipidi at the Hertie School did a very interesting article recently in Journal of Democracy about the difference, how governance and democracy are actually, they don't go together, and democracy can be functioning perfectly well while governance goes down the pan, and that the problem, the EU actually could go after governance more effectively than democracy. So I think that's a really interesting area. But I wanted to come to this issue of the party families, because something really big is about to happen in Europe that unfortunately runs in exactly the opposite direction of your very helpful comments. You're saying they can be a bulwark for democracy. I think what's about to happen on the 22nd and the 25th of May is that they're going to become a big part of the problem. So European Parliament elections are very likely to bring in 20, 25, maybe 30% populists into the EU. And, well, one issue is whether the populists will get together and be effective in using the Parliament as more than a giant YouTube channel, which is what they use it for at the moment. They just make a racist speech, denounce the Roma, and then put it on YouTube. That's all they do. But once they're at 25, 30%, they can take over committees, they can write reports, they can use EP money. There's lots of other things they can do. So how will the mainstream parties react? Probably they'll try and form a grand coalition. And that will kind of keep the EU functioning. It will allow important votes through. Sounds fine, but there is a large amount of populism now within the mainstream parties. And having 25% populists in the parliament will bring out more populism in the overall debate. And the risk is that the mainstream parties, the EPP, the S&D, I hope not the Liberals and the Greens, tell me, Francisca, it won't happen, but there's a real risk that what you end up doing is just having a much more populist parliament in general, which is reluctant to criticise national governments. And remember that the S&D group hesitated a lot before they criticised Ponta, They started off supporting him and then realised they were getting into very deep water, and then they withdrew. But if they could have kept supporting him, I think they would have done. It's not, their instinct is not to call their members to account and uphold standards of democracy. The instinct is tribal. It's to protect their own and to maintain the number of members. They don't want people leaving their party family because that reduces the number of seats they have in the parliament, so it reduces their power. So the incentive structure is all wrong for them to be what you were calling for, which is to be actually an institution which protects standards and keeps their party members to a very high level. What the danger is that because there are very few mechanisms for party discipline in the European Parliament, there's no whip system, there's no also, MEPs are not paid by their party groupings. As a result, what you could see is mainstream EPP members, even some of the S&D members and others, just voting with the populists quite regularly on a number of issues, on the returns directive on migrants, on the funding, on abortion, on gay marriage, on a huge range of issues. And the problem is that then the party families could just become a big part of the problem because they will defend the current system rather than calling for change. And that really worries me, because it means that if we come back to the list we had earlier about who should be the guardian of democracy, the representative of the people in Brussels is going to bring the whole system into disrepute if it starts to behave like this. And then what will the member states do? They'll find it difficult to get business through the parliament, so they'll start sidelining it and doing deals among themselves. We'll go into much more intergovernmentalism, deals behind closed doors. This is not good for democracy at European level. This is going to exacerbate the democratic deficit.
I just thought for a moment that we were on a positive track, but maybe Franziska on this issue, and then we have to questions very short, answers reasonably short.
Yeah, on the EU and the funding, of course the EU can monitor, the Commission can monitor if there was a proper call for proposals, and then they can check if there are 5 cents missing. But what the EU cannot check is the substance and if there is any corruption behind it. And I was in the budget committee, and I was negotiating for 2.5 years, the financial regulation. And we as a parliament try to get in that the member states have to sign a declaration and say we spent the money in the intention of the, law that was adopted that brought you that money. Member states refused. They were vehemently opposing any responsibility for the money they spent themselves alone. Because with that declaration, the national parliaments could have hold the government accountable on how they spend it. Really, that was a fight for 2.5 years. We lost it. The parliament didn't win in the end. And that is the craziness of EU funding, and that's why it's so likely to be abused for corruption and petty my friends get the money, because there's no real control on it. You just have to make a proper call for proposals and then make sure that you spend the 5 cents correctly. The rest nobody really checks, at least no European level. National parliaments can empower themselves to check it, but with the majority then they usually don't. And that's a real problem we have at European level. And we have been trying to get around it. We did not win. And I have to say, some other big member states were also not in favor of it, because every single government across Europe uses it to buffer up some difficult social groups, and especially in the agricultural field as well. So that one, sorry if I have to, but it's just a fact I wanted to, it's the EU cannot do it. We tried, we would have to change the financial regulation for it again. On the European Party, the funding rules for the parties come up again. We as Greens try to get in some rules on, can you get the funding if you don't have some internal party discipline on democratic rules? Oh, very difficult to get there. But, some public push on that could help too. And it all depends, of course, on the courage of leaders. If Merkel says, I don't talk to Orban, that makes a much bigger difference than if, the parliament even votes on it. So I think it's a lot on responsibility of the leaders, but the funding rules might help. I'm not so optimistic about this one. And yes, the Grand Coalition, I think there I share Heather's impression. We will have a Grand Coalition which will tighten them and will bring them even less in situations of criticizing anybody from their party. And yes, in the European Parliament, you can spend so much money as an individual member. It's beautiful if you have good ideas, but it's also terrible if you want to promote, non-democratic things, because nobody's checking, not your party. In the Bundestag, it's very different. I don't have a cent that I can spend alone. It's all the political group. I hate it, because you always have to get first agreement of your party group. But it's very different in the European Parliament, where you have so much freedom, and de facto you can do whatever you want. And every group wants you to stay in because you vote, and it's counting anyway. So, and on the Fundamental Rights Agency, you can't make it mandatory to ask them unless they have the mandate to do countries. We were in this already. The Parliament tried, but then they said no, unless the Fundamental Rights Agency actually has the mandate to do it, we can't make it mandatory. So it's sort of running in circles.
Okay. Jan Werner, or do you want to pass?
Just very briefly. So I think here we have two cases where what we usually take to be vectors of democratization pointing in different directions. First, on the point of the market. So I think it's generally important that we don't discuss the EU as if it was founded in the 50s for the sake of democracy. Clearly, it was founded for peace and prosperity and for market making and so on. Now, what the free market de facto does today is that it allows countries to export their opposition. The most discontent are going to go to London, to Berlin, etc. Very different situation from the Cold War, let's say. We also have a situation, maybe less obviously, where as long as you're in that market, the EU will come ever so often and say, here's a bunch of essentially, forgive me for putting it so crudely, neoliberal policy proposals that you have to implement. And then in a sense we now have a rival model which says, hey, if you want to make the gas cheaper, we're going to give you a lot of money. And we're not going to meddle internally with you at all. And you can keep utility prices very low, and you can get re-elected, you become very popular, and so on and so forth. I mean, think about Ukraine in that context. On the one side, the World Bank says you basically have to raise gas prices because our program says you've got to do it like this, and then the rival offer. That's clearly not the whole story. I'm not saying this explains everything, but I think especially again if we think about strategy, what are we trying to achieve, and what are the instruments, and how does this look as part of a bigger picture? We can't just leave all that out. On the parties, just very briefly, I agree with everything that has been said, but again here, the push towards democracy, quote unquote, along the lines of now we can actually determine whether Martin Schulz or Juncker is going to be the Commission President, if it were to come to that, more democratic. At the same time, it of course, if you are the EPP, makes you think twice about whether you now were to kick out Fidesz, as some big symbolic gesture. Beforehand, it didn't matter all that much whether you had a couple more votes or not. All of a sudden, it could really matter whether you get that majority. So again, democracy in a sense pointing in different directions.
Well, that brings us to another question which we don't have time to discuss. The EU as a system, how democratic it is. But Andras, maybe also to the market.
Some very short remarks about the role of politicians. I think it's very important that they exert pressure on in the same party family. It's an important tool, but it is very unreliable, as we have heard. So we cannot really build on that. The second, whether markets can somehow control such situations, they cannot, because markets, like financial markets, basically pay attention to a very limited small area which has something to do with democracy. They want independence of courts. That actually does matter for markets, and fair trial, or trial shouldn't be too long, but that's not a solution either. And the question about the European public prosecutor, in theory the EU does have the possibility to go after the money and corruption cases, but only in cooperation with the local police and only in cooperation with the local authorities. And this is exactly why it doesn't work, because that's the nature of the business. What you do not have, and what would be needed is some kind of FBI type of European FBI type, and the guys come and handcuff the politician, and they put them away. And there is a proposal for that by Viviane Reding that's on the table. She wants to do that, and that would be I think that would be much more important than any, like institutions, which other institutions which are on the table.
So now the proposals are getting more and more concrete, the European FBI. So we have more questions, and now the questions have been sort of speed and speed questions and speed answers. Yep, Daphne.
Daphne Bullisberg, European Alternatives. Actually, I don't have a question. I have a remark because I'm grateful the panel has mentioned the issue of media freedom a few times, and European Alternatives has initiated a European Citizens Initiative for media freedom and media pluralism, exactly for the reason that you've mentioned, and it was initiated in Hungary and Italy. And so, if you want to do something by walking out of this room, sign the media initiative, the European Citizens Initiative for media freedom.
Okay. Something concrete? Yes? Yeah.
István Egedűs, my comment about preemptive Euroscepticism, what Jan mentioned, I would like to add that certainly this was an argument even coming from the European Parliament that we should be very careful because whenever we intervene it helps Fidesz and even Jobbik. Now my comment is that actually it's not true, since the majority of the Hungarian population still is very pro-EU, and actually this freedom fight against the EU did not work very well by Fidesz. Something else worked very well yesterday, but it was not the anti-EU stance. Now my question is about the future. It's more a Kremlinologist question. In case Orbán will introduce a new constitutional change in 2-3 years, that he would become the new president of the republic, having all the competences of the prime minister right now, what the EU can do. I understand all the problems you mentioned, legal, political, family, and so on. What if the parliament in 2-3 years will vote for a new president, that's him, for 7 years? Whether there is any strategy or the momentum is out because of the new, more Eurosceptic Europarlament in the future.
Yes, please.
Thank you, Dieter Detke, Georgetown University. I'm very much in favor of Jan Werner Müller's proposal to create a Copenhagen Commission, and there's another proposal to create a rule of law commission by the 4 foreign ministers of Germany, Netherlands, Sweden, and Finland. Now, that's all very good, and I think we need it in order to uphold standards and values. But here's my question. How can we better encourage pro-European forces in individual countries? And I think that's very necessary to think about it. Go back to the original and to the beginning of European integration when we had these Jean Monnet committees. That was a civil society initiative, very effective. It included party leaders, unions, media, and that's a very important element of awakening new pro-European forces. And we have them everywhere, but they need encouragement. And I think it was a big mistake of the European Union to give up all civil society programs after states became full members. All these programs moved out to other areas. Nothing against it. Fine to be more active in the Eastern Partnership, Southern Partnership, developing countries. But inside Europe needs encouragement, and that's what I would like to ask you. Thank you.
Okay. The media pluralism, we can deal with it straight when we walk out. Then the Orban and 7 years. Maybe we start with you. What can we do?
What's the question again? Sorry. What?
Yeah. What will happen if Orban is president and will stay there for 7 years? Is there anything one can do?
I mean, just the fact that you introduce a presidential system, I cannot see, the problem. That's not the issue here. Mm-hmm. I mean, I'm not entirely sure what would be any how you could conceptualize the problem in that case.
Well, I think this is the thing. There is no agreement on this. There's no democratic acquis. There's no model for the EU to draw. I can tell you exactly what will happen inside the Commission when this thing gets if such a thing is proposed. Because I remember this very well when the Turks started thinking about it. So I was in DG Enlargement at the time, and essentially what will happen is everybody in the Commission will go, okay, we have no acquis. Let's call the Venice Commission and get a nice opinion. That will also put off the issue by several months, and then we can work out what the member states think and see whether there's political support to criticize it in some way. And then let's see, are there any kind of legal bases that we can draw on? Probably not very much. And then when the Venice Commission report comes back, then we'll see how much room there is really to say, well, this is not in line with the best practices internationally. This isn't really the kind of model. But it'll be that kind of thing, and it's not going to have a big impact. And by then, he'll be president. So, because, as Jan Werner pointed out, in the 1950s, the EU was not set up to be a guardian of democracy. It was set up to be an economic integration project. Okay, so it was set up for one purpose, and the community of law is based on a particular purpose, the logic that this is about technical issues and it's about economic integration, which over time will lead to more political integration. This is the functionalist logic of the EU. It's a tank. It trundles along very slowly. It works, but it's very hard to deflect, and it keeps going, and over 50 years it can go a very, very long way. It's kind of slow and steady and reliable, not terribly exciting, but it kind of trundles along. Now we're trying to give it wings and a jet engine and make it fly. Okay, it can't do it very well. It's never going to be aerodynamic. It's going to look like a brick that's flying. And then we're going to say, well, this is terrible. Look at this EU. Think about what is its purpose. Is it fit for its purpose? Now, if we wanted to do other things, you need to redesign it. You need to retrofit. And that retrofitting is quite ugly, and it's quite cumbersome. It's very inefficient. It's quite expensive, and it may not work very well. I think actually what would make more sense, probably, given we're coming up with radical ideas this afternoon, is in fact to try to create something between the EU and the Council of Europe. You'd need something in the middle that doesn't have membership of Azerbaijan, Russia, Ukraine, and so on, but which has some kind of international standing. The problem is that international bodies no longer have the kind of standing that they used to. This is, we're 25 years after the end of the Cold War. The idea of calling on an international institution to come and solve your problems is increasingly unpopular. I think Bela Grešković said this morning, we don't want international bodies coming and telling us how to use a knife and fork anymore. Everybody, that era has kind of finished. And that's also for the new member states as much as for the old ones. So now we're onto new political terrain, where countries do want to sort these things out for themselves, but the constitution making is not an area where there's that much popular involvement. I think it really does have to come from below. It has to come from the grassroots. I'm quite pessimistic that in the end we're going to end up with some kind of international body, including at EU level, that can help very fundamentally with these heavy constitutional questions. It can help on some areas, and we've talked about a number of them today, but it's not going to solve the problem. That in the end is up to the people. And again, to quote, I thought the very interesting beginning, the discussion this morning, the link with the first session we had when Tamás Gáspár said, if you are the embodiment of the nation, the definition is yours. This question of defining the nation is absolutely critical in deciding who gets to decide on constitutional provisions. And that's the real danger of the new nation-based populism.
Okay, I just heard from our German chairman that we have some more time. But coming to the question about the Monet committees and your idea of a Copenhagen Commission and the role of the Fundamental Rights Agency, maybe I combine this to the question, why don't you think the Fundamental Rights Agency is enough? We have an agency, it could be uploaded, it could be, run the Copenhagen Commission, why something new? Or your question or your remark that something new between the Council of Europe and the European Commission, isn't it easier to use something which is already there than create something new?
Undoubtedly it is. The only thing is, as we've been trying to say a number of times, it's not all about fundamental rights. And so we cannot, in a sense, redefine all these systemic problems as necessarily being about fundamental rights violations. The other thing is simply, but in a sense I'm shooting myself in the foot because it doesn't mean that something else will be easier, but agencies in an EU context are often compromises which allow the member states to keep a fair amount of control. So it's sort of in their DNA that they answer to member states, are controlled by member states. I mean, I agree, it would be great if we could redefine the mandate and so on and so forth, but even that, it's a particular kind of institution, body, beast, if you like, that one is dealing with. And that doesn't change overnight, even if miraculously you could extend the mandate. Just very briefly on Dieter Depke's point. So I agree that the more that could be done in terms of civil society bottom up. I mean, we can say this all day. Nobody disagrees, right? The question is, what does it mean concretely? I think we shouldn't go back to an era where, oh, here's a T-shirt from the EU for you, and that's sort of that's what it means to make people love the EU more. All this sort of PR thinking, which had sort of its heyday in the run-up to the constitutional treaty, I think we should hopefully dispense with and basically go back to real questions and take people seriously, because their first question is going to be in at least 17 or 18 countries about the euro crisis when they hear about the EU, and not about any stuff about peace and the 50s and so on and so forth. And if we have good answers to that, then that's sort of the debate we should have.
Okay, we have 2 last questions, or 3. Okay, let's take the last 3 questions. Here, Council of Europe, and there, and then over there.
Thank you. Yes, Michael Remmert of the Council of Europe. I'm not working for the Secretariat of the Venice Commission, but still my interest is, of course, in the question of the Copenhagen Commission. I can be brief because it partly has been discussed already on the question of whether there should need to be new institutions or not, whether there should be something perhaps between the Council of Europe and the European Union. I would just make a plea for trying to work as much as we can on the basis of existing institutions, rather than to multiply new ones, because that too is a legitimacy problem in some way, and people might not understand why each time we need to invent a new institution, rather than perhaps adapting the working methods to new needs. So certainly having Azerbaijan experts and others in the Venice Commission might not prevent the Venice Commission to take into account the EU acquis when talking about EU countries, or for that matter, countries who are accession candidates to the EU, with which perhaps a Copenhagen Commission wouldn't deal. So just last point, there is some convergence already if we take, for example, the upcoming accession of the European Union to the European Convention on Human Rights. So certainly these can be recalibrated in order to come to a broader mandate.
Okay, please.
Thank you. Nicolette Harlambido, Vice Chair of the European Network Against Racism. In the morning session and in this session, a lot has been mentioned about civil society. Everybody has identified civil society as one of the most important stakeholders as a guardian of democracy, and speaking as a civil society member, I think we should also try to think who is the civil society and whether they are also targeted within this general framework and system that you have described in the morning and in this session. I mean, you have civil society organizations working on different levels, on different aspects, on different issues. Normally, it could be a few committed individuals at a very grassroots level working on their vision on how they want to see society. You may have national NGOs, you may have European networks such as our network, and they work at national, European level, etc. But they are also targeted. They are also targeted, especially speaking on issues of racism and xenophobia. We have many of our members at the national level have been targeted for their work. We expect this to become a more serious matter, and we expect this to become also at EU level. We are afraid with the European Parliament elections and the rising in the far-right groups in the European Parliament, networks of NGOs working at European level to be targeted as well. We already had questions from far-right representatives in the European Parliament about funding to the European Network Against Racism. So we see this becoming a more serious concern. And I would like your views on how you would see civil society being strengthened so as to become a real stakeholder in the fight in our mandate against racism and xenophobia, but in general to support democratic processes and to support rethinking on how our democracies are going to develop. and by saying this, I just wanted also to note that I mean the EU, as the institutions of the EU, by themselves, they have a democratic deficit. I mean, there is a different treatment of civil society organizations vis-à-vis the Commission or the European Parliament or the Council. In the Council, there's complete transparency. Nobody knows what is discussed and how it's discussed in the Parliament, and NGOs don't have a role there. And also, whereas the EU has adopted a declaration on human rights defenders, for example, applicable in third countries, it does not have a declaration on human rights defenders for the EU. Apparently, it's considered that human rights defenders are free to act in the European Union, which is not the case. I mean, we can bring many examples of criminalization of human rights defenders. So I wanted a bit your...
Okay. Yeah, a very short question there, and then Kati. But short.
Yes. So the European Commission proposed in the draft of the Audiovisual Media Services Directive a binding rule that supervisory bodies, media councils, which supervise the media system in our member states should be independent. There should be safeguards to have those bodies independent. And this proposal, this provision of the proposal of the European Commission didn't make it to the directive, and this is why our European Commission couldn't require the Hungarian government in 2011 to change the law in regard the Media Council, which has been one of the tools through which the government controls the media, which to a great extent contributed to the tragic election results yesterday. I wonder, how do you see this failure, common failure of our European media policy? And I would like to add just very quickly that I think we really should not buy the either mistaken or Hippocratic point that diversity in your European Union requires to leave it for member states, whatever way they want to regulate the composition of media council. I think that's mistaken and Hippocratic. If anyone would come up with that explanation. Thank you.
Okay, but there we have an expert. Maybe you can connect to each other. Daphne. Kati?
Yes, this is directed to Heather, since you've described the EU variously as a tank and a brick, and definitely not aerodynamic, and that we could not expect a timely reaction from the EU if Orban made himself president for life. What would be a triggering event that would elicit a timely reaction from the EU in the political realm? Can you speculate on what would?
The answer is there's no threshold, because there's no rule book. There's not even a playbook on this at EU level. It's what other member states would consider to be unacceptable. It's a club. So it's about norms, it's about the unwritten rules of what's acceptable and unacceptable. There is the written rules in the form of the acquis, which don't have very much on democracy at all. And the unwritten rules are what other prime ministers cannot tolerate. We came back to the whole question about who's the somebody somewhere who makes the call, the overall political judgment of whether there is a democracy. And in the end, that's the other member states. And that's why I'm so concerned about the rise of populism, because it brings down the bar overall in the EU. It makes all of the prime ministers feel under pressure from populism, feel under pressure to be more populistic in their own rhetoric, in their own dialogue with their own populations, and therefore they will hold others to lower standards. So that's why I think the trigger goes up higher, because the threshold has come down, the trigger goes up higher, and they're very reluctant to do it. What would be considered a shocking event, like forming a coalition with a far-right party with an openly racist agenda, as happened in 1999, is no longer shocking. Yeah, it's fine. It's okay. Nobody even blinks. You can think about Denmark in the early 2000s with the Danish People's Party. Think about what's happening in Slovakia now. And so sort of the norm, the overall sense of what is acceptable behavior in a government is changing. It's changing in Europe. And I think the only way to deal with this is not to create an EU-level rule, because the member states just won't agree on it. It's actually to raise the standard of debate about democracy in the EU. So here I have a proposal for CEU. I have a new job for political theorists and political philosophers, of which I think there are quite a few in the room, including the ones next to me. I think it's really helpful to have the kinds of proposals that you're putting forward, Jan Werner, just to remind people of how much the debate has changed, on how in the 90s this was considered really routine, really normal. That what's normal in politics is changing around us, and we're kind of, we're the frog in the water that's slowly heating up. We're kind of unaware of how much this is already affecting our democracies. And so it's really important now, I think, to have perhaps not so much a commission of elder statesmen and legal experts as to have a commission of philosophers to discuss what is democracy in Europe today, and in particular to put out a list of what is unacceptable, what is not democracy. At least if we could have a negative list, that would be a good start.
Okay. Well, let's enter the final round. Maybe.
So Plato would approve. Theorists always have great anxieties about being irrelevant and sidelined. So thanks for keeping us in play. So just on this, actually, just one brief remark on this point. So I agree with you a lot in terms of we don't really know what the scenarios would be. Probably it is true that we would no longer say that Article 7 is a nuclear option if tomorrow a bunch of colonels in some countries say the junta is back. So it's not impossible to imagine certain scenarios. At the same time, I'm not entirely convinced that it's always like a club. The EU in the context of the Euro crisis did not function like a club. It was not enough to have a seat at the table to say that we have concerns about this and so on. So. And I think people are aware of this now. They're also aware of interdependence in a way they weren't aware of interdependence before the Euro crisis. So just desperately trying to finish up on a positive note, I think we ought to use this moment, of crisis. I mean, forgive the cliche that, no crisis should be wasted. But in the sense of saying, look, it is a very peculiar moment. I mean, there is a sense that nobody can deny anymore that the EU matters, that it can really meddle in your life in a big way. And if people remember that grudgingly maybe we've accepted this on the economic front to a degree that would have been unthinkable 10 years ago, there's a kind of space for debate about the political side. But at the same time, I think it's not, I agree we should have more debate. I mean, again, nobody's against that. But I think ultimately it will need some authoritative body that calls the shots. And the debate is relevant for that. But we need to ask ourselves whether we ultimately are willing to empower such a body or not. And if we say we're not willing to do that, we have to think through the consequences for us as individual European citizens, because it means that you will be governed by person X in country Y, who you might say, look, I don't think that's a democratic process anymore, and then you can't do anything about it.
So, Franziska, I count on you to continue this positive trend.
Yeah, I first have to disagree on a few points.
On a few?
On the question of populism and standard of governance, I have the impression that it was not the pressure from populists, but mainstream parties putting up populist proposals and then making them completely acceptable and thereby pushing also the populist up. And we are seeing this right now in Germany with the CSU, Bavaria, putting up proposals which are definitely populist, and then everybody's surprised why the AfD, the anti-European party in Germany now is gaining in votes. I think it's really the problem that we have with mainstream parties, and I think the pressure is, could be stood if they really wanted. On the question of the media law, I can just say, the majorities decide in the European Parliament and in the Council. If you want different majorities, you have to vote differently and have to go to vote. That's the only answer I can always give. I'm like, it's majorities. And this is defined by you and by us, across Europe. And you already, as Hungarian, have a bit more influence than those from Malta or Cyprus, with, quite a few seats in there. Also on the Fundamental Rights Agency, I think, when I'm talking about enlarging the mandate, I'm enlarging it from fundamental rights also to systematic abuse of democratic principles. So that would be my idea of saying we have an institution there, it has smart people there, it's sort of recognized. And I don't believe that any institution you will create at a European level will be more independent than an agency. I mean, like, it will always depend to some extent on member states. Don't fool yourself. There I very much agree with Heather. After all, in the end, it always depends, sort of, it goes to where the member states also, what they are ready to accept. So, in the way to believe that if you set up a new commission, it will be completely independent of member states, I just don't believe it. And I think sometimes it's easier to change something than to create something new where member states would be, oh my God, what is this now about? Than going with something they're maybe used to. And then the question of the financial, I very much agree. We're not a club. We saw on, Greece, go into Greece and ask them if they know what the sanctions are about. They very much know how sanctions work and what they have to do. And we actually, as Greens, always argue to link that to the question of rule of law and anti-corruption. Because we believe, last week, they liberalized the milk market by the Haltbarkeitsdatum, the expiry date of the milk was in Greece 5 days, and now it's 7 days, so that the industrial milk products can come in, because 5 days they can't keep. So that was the liberalizing of the milk market, which was, heavily discussed in Greece. Will destroy all the small milk farmers, and is, very successful EU policy. And we believe that fundamentally Greece has a much more deep problem of corruption, of a captured state, and as long as you don't target that, you will not get Greece out of crisis. So we always said, why don't you link the two? You have such a huge tool. Why don't you put it up there for anti-corruption work instead of reforming the milk market? But that we didn't have a lot of majorities behind us, because everybody was afraid, and once you become target country, you will actually have to give up on your corruption and on your high levels of nepotism. Much easier to reform the milk market than going against corruption in your own country. So that's, I think there could be potential for actually leverage. It's of course not for all countries, but already there we didn't use it. And I think if we don't go, what will get young people or Europeans again to believe in Europe? I think it's a human rights, democracy, freedom agenda. I really believe it. And I think if we don't go there, if we don't make everybody aware that this is the union that defends your individual rights and your right to democracy, I don't know what we're going to go about, because that's going to come with populism, right-wing people, racists rising up. If the EU doesn't take this as an objective of its being, I think it lost a huge opportunity. And I'm very worried about the tax on civil society. We have the Citizens Initiative, which just won 1 million, is the one to stop funding to those organizations, civil society organizations that do sexual health education. And I think this is terrible. This is terrible. We will stop all the counseling on the pill, it's scary. And this will target a lot of NGOs. I'm very worried about it. It's the Catholic Church behind it. It's very well organized. It was in all the churches across Europe, and it had to 1 million in no time. And they're planning many more against homosexuality, and there are many more in the pipeline. And if we don't build up against this, we will, really be losing out.
Okay, Andras.
Just two very short remarks. One is, why was the committee of wise men successful in Austria? It was successful. I agree with Jan-Werner Müller, but I think it was successful because everybody just wanted to finish the whole thing. Everybody knew that it doesn't work. All European governments, they got into this boycott, and they just didn't know how to get out of it without losing the face. That was the excellent solution for everybody, and also obviously also for the Austrians. So there was actually no conflict. If you have a conflict, then you need a court to decide the conflict. The second remark is about civil society, as you also mentioned it, that it's we always hear that for democracy you need civil society, and you do need it, because civil society helps to spread certain information, helps to conceptualize problems within society. But we have to know that civil society is actually a deeply undemocratic thing. Just 10 of you, we just have a new small society, and we say that we speak for this civil society or for this group. You can build up huge variety of groups. It doesn't really matter. It's just a secondary importance how big that group is or how representative that is. What is really representative in a democracy, that's the parliament, with the right electoral rules. But civil society is not representative of the people. In that sense, it is hugely undemocratic, and it has an important rule, informal rule in spreading certain ideas and mentalities. But I would be very afraid to give any stronger formal rule to civil society and to groups.
Okay, thank you. Thank you to the panelists here. There was a very rich discussion. I think we finished on a semi-positive note. I'm a big fan of positive self-fulfilling prophecies. So maybe we are at the start of it. At least we will continue the discussion actually tomorrow also in Berlin on specific things. As a moderator, I did terribly because we are half an hour late. But I would remind all the German speakers here that we had a great television show called Wetten, das, and they always extended, and then they were doing well, and now they always finish on time and they get axed by the end of the year. So maybe with that, thank you and...